For this episode, I'm going to be Frank Castle. Hello, I'm Joe, and welcome to Same Name, Different Game. If you haven't noticed, there is yet another superhero movie smashing up box office records right now, and that means that it's time for me to do another episode of this show based on comic book games. But what to do? I've already done Captain America and the Avengers, I did Sega Spider-Man games. You know, I could do Marvel superheroes, that would be appropriate. It is based on the Infinity War saga after all. But, yeah, I just did a Marvel Capcom fighting game not that long ago, so... You know, I've been meaning to do a Punisher episode for a while, and I didn't do one when his new show came out last year, so let's do that. Yeah, he's not in the movie, but so what? Let's dive in with a little history. The Punisher was created in 1974, primarily by Jerry Conway and Ross Andru, with input from John Romita Sr. and Stan Lee, and first appeared in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 129, where he's hired by the Jackal to kill the Wallcrawler. He almost immediately transitioned out of being a villain to an anti-hero character, killing bad guys without remorse, which was a fairly unique trait in 70s mainstream comics. The Punisher is, in fact, Frank Castle, a former Marine whose family is killed in Central Park after witnessing a mob hit. The gangsters in question thought they got Frank too, but they were wrong. Frank survives. Overcome with grief and rage, he becomes the Punisher and starts committing extrajudicial murders all over New York. Punisher lends himself well to both films and video games, and as such was only the second Marvel character to get a feature-length theatrical film, starring Dolph Lundgren as Frank. Howard the Duck was the first, if you're curious. He's subsequently been featured in 2 more films and is currently portrayed by Jon Bernthal in the Marvel Cinematic Universe on the Netflix shows, first in Season 2 of Daredevil, then his own show. Now, he wasn't exactly on the vanguard when it came to video games, but he has been in a fair few, starting in 1990 when he made both his computer and console debut. Now, the computer games are on a variety of formats that I don't know anything about, but the console debut is the first game that we will be talking about this episode. It is The Punisher on the NES, published by LJN in North America only. Now I know what you're thinking. LJN, Beam Software, this game must be trash. Then, well, I have to be honest, this is probably LJN's best release on the NES, and almost certainly Beam Software's best original work. The game is a gallery-style shooter along the lines of Cabal, but different in a couple of important ways. Cabal has cover and evasive maneuvers for your character, and it also shows the full body of your soldier. Punisher, however, shows only half of Frank's body, he's given no cover, and has no means of moving any faster than the default. Fortunately, the developers took this into account, as enemy bullets move pretty slowly. Not so much so as to make things too easy, but not so fast as to make the game unfair. The story is almost non-existent, which is kind of a recurring trend, as you'll see. Frank is out to punish the worst of New York's crime syndicates, headed by the Kingpin. Along the way, he'll take on Jigsaw, Hitman, C-Joe, and a couple of completely made-up characters in the guise of a robot named Assassin and an arms dealer named Colonel Klieg. Even C-Joe is a relative nobody, having appeared in a grand total of 4 issues of Marvel Comics. But still, the boss battles mix things up a bit, allowing Frank to get up close and personal with his enemies. By default, Castle has an Uzi and a handful of grenades, though the Uzi can be upgraded to a machine gun and the grenades to a bazooka. The machine gun, referred to as a super gun in the game, fires faster and does much more damage. It's available either as a pickup or as a bonus if you kill 100% of the enemies in a given stage. And it's so overpowered that if you 100% a stage right before a boss, that boss becomes more or less trivial. The bazooka allows you to fire explosives anywhere on the screen. This is different from the grenades, which only fire directly in front of Frank. Other pickups include some kind of body armor, which extends your health bar, health to fill that bar, and ammo for your guns. Now if you run out of ammo on your default Uzi, no worries, you can still fire single shots, you just lose your rapid fire ability. And this is going to happen because bonus items of all stripes are hidden in the destructible environments, as are the entrances to bonus areas, replete with power-ups. So you have to shoot, shoot, and shoot. Just make sure that while you're shooting, you don't hit the Sax guy. If Punisher kills an innocent, of which Sax guy is the only one in this game, he loses a ton of health. Overall, it's not a terrible game. It's not Wild Guns or Sin and Punishment, but it's better than you would expect from an LJN production. The only real problem is that, yeah, there are 6 stages, but there's only a handful of locales, which means you're going to see the same backgrounds repeating over and over again throughout those 6 stages. Now, since it was 1990 and it was LJN, of course, there's a Game Boy port. Now, this doesn't really fall into the purview of this show because it doesn't have the same name, but I did learn my lesson after I didn't mention the Twin Snakes in the Metal Gear Solid episode. So... The Punisher, The Ultimate Payback, is basically the NES game with a few tweaks, most notably that Frank isn't shown on screen due to the smaller resolution of the Game Boy display. Another change is the inclusion of Spider-Man, who facilitates Punisher's murder spree, which feels pretty weird. The whole first stage is bizarre, honestly. Punisher goes into a mall and just opens fire, and unlike the NES game, there are a lot more innocents around. Spider-Man being okay with this is just odd. And even if you ignore that, it's a pretty weak port of the NES game. I mean, it's not terrible, but quite frankly, unless you're a Punisher superfan, there's really no need to play this version at all. And that brings us to what might be our most well-known game this episode. In 1993, in the midst of their arcade renaissance, Capcom released a belt-scrolling beat-em-up based on the Punisher into arcades in the US and Europe. This was right around the same time as Captain Commando, Alien vs. Predator, the first D&D game. Capcom was killing the arcades then. Or, at the very least, they were severely beating the arcades within an inch of their life. And while I won't say Punisher is as good as Tower of Doom or Alien vs. Predator, I find it outclasses Final Fight and even later brawlers from the House of Mega Man like Knights of the Round. This game's story is also basically non-existent. Following the mold set by the NES game, the Kingpin is, well, the Kingpin of crime in New York, and Frank is all set to take him down, this time with help from Nick Fury. That is, Nick Fury when Nick Fury was a white guy, unfortunately. Because, I mean, how sweet would it be if you could play as Sam Jackson Nick Fury in this game? While the story isn't really worth talking about, the game does have some great cutscenes, and there are actually 3 versions of most of them. One with just Frank, one with just Fury, and a 2-player version, which usually involves Nick chiding Castle for his overly violent tactics. Now, like the NES game, this one uses mostly comic characters for bosses. Kingpin is your final challenge once again, of course. You face Bonebreaker, who, yeah, sure, he's an X-Men villain, but whatever, as well as Jigsaw, of course, and more. This is also the only game I'm talking about today that features Frank's buddy Microchip, who revives him on the continue screen. Gameplay-wise, this is definitely a 90s arcade brawler, but it adds a few unique touches to set it apart from the crowd. First, in what feels like a test run for Alien vs. Predator, Punisher and Fury have guns they can pull out, but unlike the later sci-fi beat-em-up, they can only pull their guns when there are enemies with firearms around them. Still, this makes for some fun segments where you can blow away legions of enemies. And if you don't have your sidearm handy, well, there are plenty of other weapons. Knives, grenades, battle axes, warhammers, and even a lance reminiscent of a certain Capcom hero. Every weapon has a limited number of uses, but a lot of them are pretty high, and the bat even splinters and lets you stab someone on the last shot. For when you're barehanded, the game also features a few command inputs almost like Street Fighter. For example, by pushing down up an attack, you can do a strong attack that doesn't take health, like doing a both buttons special attack does. You also have a variety of grapple moves, not just grab, punch, toss. You can do that, but you can also jump and toss, or by pressing down an attack after jumping, do an Izuna drop style pile driver. You can also do a both buttons special when grabbing the enemy, which results in an awesome crowd clearing Cesaro style giant swing. This game is a total blast, no pun intended, and I absolutely recommend 100% that if you see it in an arcade, give it a try. But what if you want to play it at home? Well, turns out there was a home port, which brings us to our next game for this episode, The Punisher on the Sega Genesis. Despite Capcom being a major factor in the Mega Drive's early success, with Sega developed and published ports of games like Strider and Ghouls and Ghosts, Capcom themselves only published a scant 6 games on the Genesis across all territories. Compare that with over 5 times as many on the Super NES, and it's easy to see which side their bread was buttered on during the 4th generation. Now that's why it's interesting that the only home port of this game was to Sega's 16-bit console. The port, developed by WWF stalwart Sculptured Software, was released in the US in 1994 and Europe in 1995, and it's kinda rough. The game is still there in broad strokes, but a lot of what made it fun in the arcade is gone. The first thing you're likely to notice is the choppy scrolling. The system was 6 years old by this point. You'd think smooth scrolling wouldn't be a problem, but here we are. The next thing you'll probably notice is that a few of the moves from the arcade are eliminated, including the giant swing. Weapons are much more fragile than in the arcade, and many of them are just straight up missing. I hope you enjoy bats and knives. The guns fire at a much slower rate, and the special guns, like machine guns that you can pick up, don't stun enemies quite the same way they do in the arcade. And speaking of slow, the roll, which acts as a dash in the arcade game, seems to actually reduce your speed from normal walking in this home version. This version also removes a ton of different enemy sprites, leaving 2 very common enemies and a small handful of less common ones. The female enemies remain, but have more modest clothing, and the amount of blood is reduced throughout. On a related note, the splintered baseball bat is gone too. Now, a lot of that could be forgiven, but the biggest problem, without question, is the hit detection. The arcade game gives you quite a bit of leeway. You don't have to be on the exact same plane as your enemies, but in the port, you have to be within a few pixels or you'll whiff completely, and then you'll be the one getting punished. This quirk is somehow even more frustrating when it comes to weapons. Ultimately, Punisher on Genesis isn't worth your time. It wasn't then. I mean, Streets of Rage 3 came out on the Genesis the same year, so if you needed your beat-em-up fix, you knew where to go. And sadly, it's also way too expensive in the current aftermarket. Expect to pay $70 at least for a bare cart, over $100 if you want it complete. I got mine at a local retro shop a number of years ago for a fraction of that. I would never pay the current asking price, and you shouldn't either. And that brings us to our final game for this episode. It's The Punisher on Xbox, PlayStation 2, and Windows, released on January 18th, 2005 in North America and PAL territories later that year. By this time, THQ had the license, and they enlisted the folks at Volition, best known at the time for Red Faction, to make a game based on Frank Castle's vigilante escapades. All three versions of this game are nearly identical, so I won't cover each in detail. The PC version, I'm told, has some of the more violent kills edited out, which seems odd for a PC version. The Xbox version, which is the one I'm playing, has the options to display in widescreen and progressive scan, which the PS2 version lacks. Content-wise, the PS2 and Xbox versions are identical. This game is sort of a mishmash of a comic called Welcome Back Frank and the 2004 Punisher film. The second live-action Punisher, Thomas Jane, lends his voice to Castle here, making it the first Punisher game based on a film adaptation. Kinda. I guess the NES commercial did use footage from the Dolph Lundgren film, but that game isn't based on that film in any way. The 6th gen game was penned in part by fan-favorite Punisher scribe Garth Ennis, and sees Frank hunting down the Nucci crime family and then Jigsaw because the usual reasons, really. For the most part, this is a pretty solid, if kind of unremarkable, pre-Gears of War third-person shooter. Punisher has a pretty decent selection of arms, which gets wider as the game progresses, and score is awarded by style points, which you earn by doing close-up kills and using the game's only really unique mechanic, the interrogations. By default, Frank has 4 ways to interrogate goons for information. He can punch them, he can choke them, he can slam their heads into the floor, and he can threaten them with a gun. The goal is to keep this meter here in the highlighted area for 3 seconds to break them without accidentally killing or knocking them out. Now where this really shines is in the special interrogations. You see, some areas have objects in the environment you can use to really put some fear into these mobsters and the like. You can use an incinerator, a balcony, a casket, and more. My personal favorites are at the zoo, where Frank can use piranhas, an electric eel, and a charging rhinoceros to get information out of mooks. Unfortunately, the game can't really decide how much it wants you to use these things. See, killing enemies, even after you've gotten what you need, costs you style points. Sometimes. In certain cases, even if you try to let the enemy go, you'll still see them dead after a brief loading screen. So, how do I know when I should kill them and when I shouldn't? Speaking of things that don't quite work, this game has a feature called Slaughter Mode. You build up this meter with kills and then press the Y or triangle button to activate it. Using it makes Frank basically invincible and a melee killing machine, but it's so rarely necessary that I almost never used it. Generally, shooting enemies is faster and more efficient than using Slaughter Mode. Still, the shooting feels pretty good for a game of this vintage. It's not Devil May Cry, but it's not trying to be. It does a good job of making you feel like the Punisher, which is more than I can say for a lot of comic games, even ones that I like. Sadly, the environments don't really deliver. The zoo is cool, but most of the other spots I saw were pretty bland, and in some, it's easy to get lost because there's no radar or mini-map, and sometimes the door is hidden in a shadow, it's hard to notice or find, and they all just kind of look samey. And exploration isn't rewarded at all because there's nothing to find besides the occasional hand grenade. The last criticism I have, and I really don't want to feel like I'm beating up on this game, is the boss fights. They're just bad. Straight up bad. They mostly consist of trading hits with gangsters until they die. But, again, overall, the gunplay does feel good, and the game is a great use of its license. And those are our 4 Punisher games. So now let's go ahead and do like we always do, this time with Frank Castle's various exploits. Take a look and a listen, side by side.
Controls are ruined. Have to try something else. How do I save her?
Like I tell you, asshole. I got no idea. Stop! Emergency release valve in closet behind waterfall.
The NES game isn't much of a looker, aside from Punisher himself, who looks great, honestly. Guess that's where all the resources went, because the enemies look awful, like sprites from a 1985 NES game, not a 1991. Now Capcom always does great work, and the arcade game looks and sounds absolutely wonderful. Sculptured tried their best, but the Genesis port just can't hold a candle to the original. And, well, yeah, the Xbox version, seen here, played on a 360 upscaled to 1080p, looks pretty decent for a late-era 6th generation game. Not amazing or mind-blowing or anything, but pretty good. For me, though, the Capcom arcade brawler looks and sounds the best. And that makes it time to give the edge. And it's not just king in terms of aesthetics. No, the arcade game is absolutely the clear winner here. It's aged the most gracefully, it's still the most fun, and it looks the most like a comic game. But honestly, that none of these games is a dog is kind of a miracle. Licensed games have long been infamous for their decidedly low bar of quality, and that one character could have this many games over this many generations with this many different developers and have none of them outright stink, that's shocking, frankly. And in terms of the other games, if you're even a casual Punisher fan, I would definitely recommend you check out the 6th generation version, however you can get your hands on it. It's pretty cheap, and this is the best version. If you have an Xbox 360, it's backwards compatible, so that would be the one I would go with, but PS2 is fine. And the NES game I would also check out, even if you're just a casual Punisher fan. I know it's got this rainbow on it, and everybody thinks that means a certain thing, but yeah, it's actually pretty decent. It's also cheap, by the way. Now, if you're a super fan of the Punisher, I think you probably have already checked these out, but if you haven't, you probably should. They're not as good of versions of other games that I talked about today, but yeah, none of them are straight up trash, so maybe worth a look. That does it. Thank you so much for watching, and come back next month, because summer is upon us, and if you've been watching for a while, you know what that means, so I hope to see you then. So long.
Ready! Aim!
Punish! The Punisher for Nintendo. Explosive arcade action. State-of-the-art weaponry. Got the guts? The Punisher for Nintendo from LJN. Everything's a target. Even you.
They stole it from me. This isn't vengeance. It's punishment. I never smile. But if I did, this would be it.